Linda Harper was born in 1974 in Columbus, Ohio, the middle child in a family of 3 siblings. Her father was a postal worker and her mother worked part-time at a local library. Growing up in a modest household, Linda was raised with values of hard work, family loyalty, and community reputation. By the time she entered Eastwood High School in the late 1980s, she was known as a friendly, diligent student who often blended into the background rather than seeking attention. Those who knew her back then would later describe her as the girl who always smiled politely but kept her deeper thoughts to herself. It was during those teenage years that Linda first met Richard Lawson, a charismatic classmate who excelled at sports and carried himself with an effortless charm. Richard and Linda dated briefly during their senior year, but the relationship ended quietly when Richard left town for college. For Linda, he remained a memory of youthful excitement, a fleeting glimpse of romance that contrasted with her otherwise steady, predictable life. After graduation, Linda chose to stay in Columbus, working in retail and later in a dental office. She didn't chase adventure, she built stability. In 1999, at the age of 25, Linda met Daniel Harper, a responsible young man who had just secured a stable position at a financial consulting firm. Daniel was dependable, ambitious, and polite, a man who seemed to promise security more than thrill. Their relationship moved quickly, and by September 2000, they were married in a small church ceremony surrounded by friends and relatives. Linda's parents were proud. Daniel appeared to be exactly the kind of husband they had hoped for their daughter. The Harpers eventually settled in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Columbus. Over the next 2 decades, Linda and Daniel built what looked like an enviable middle-class life. They purchased a 2-story brick house on Willow Creek Drive in 2003, had 2 children, Emily, born in 2004, and Jacob, born in 2007, and attended church on Sundays. To their neighbors, they seemed like the picture of stability, a marriage that had lasted through job changes, mortgage payments, school plays, and the daily grind of adulthood. But beneath the surface, cracks began to show. Daniel, deeply focused on his career, often worked late hours and developed a reputation for being stern, sometimes controlling, especially at home. He handled the finances, set strict rules for the children, and made most of the big decisions without much discussion. Linda, while outwardly compliant, often felt overshadowed and quietly resentful. She wanted warmth, companionship, and emotional intimacy, things Daniel was not naturally inclined to provide. Their arguments were not explosive but simmered quietly, sharp words over dinner, silent treatments that lasted for days, disagreements brushed under the rug. By the time Linda turned 45 in 2019, she found herself reflecting on her life more than ever. The children were growing older, Emily preparing for college and Jacob entering high school. The house felt emptier, her marriage more mechanical. She spent evenings scrolling through social media, sometimes stumbling across old acquaintances from high school. That was when she noticed a familiar name, Richard Lawson. He too had returned to Columbus after years away, divorced and seemingly eager to reconnect with old friends. When Eastwood High announced its 30-year reunion for October 2019, Linda felt a strange pull. She hadn't attended the previous reunions, but this time, curiosity won out. She told Daniel she was going just to catch up with old classmates, but deep down she knew there was more to it. Memories of her teenage romance with Richard surfaced, innocent yet thrilling, a contrast to the controlled, predictable routine of her marriage. That autumn evening, on October 12, 2019, the reunion was held in a rented banquet hall near downtown Columbus. The night would mark the beginning of a dangerous path, one that would ultimately unravel the life Linda had built for nearly 2 decades. At the time, however, Linda only saw it as a chance to revisit her past, a decision that seemed harmless, almost nostalgic. She could not have known that within a year her husband Daniel would be dead, and she herself would stand at the center of a criminal investigation that shook her community. The banquet hall of the Marriott Hotel in downtown Columbus was buzzing with chatter and laughter on the night of October 12, 2019. Balloons in the school colors, blue and gold, hung from the ceiling, and a banner stretched across the room reading, Eastwood High School, Class of 1989 Reunion. Former classmates mingled in groups, comparing memories, talking about careers, children, and the weight of the years. For Linda Harper, the moment she walked into the hall was like stepping back in time. She felt both nervous and strangely alive. That was when she saw him. Richard Lawson stood near the bar, drink in hand, speaking animatedly to two men she vaguely remembered from math class. Time had etched lines around his eyes, his hair flecked with gray, but his presence was unmistakable. When his eyes landed on Linda across the room, his expression shifted, surprise, then recognition, and finally a warm smile. They embraced like old friends, though the hug lingered slightly longer than it should have. Richard asked about her life, her family, and her work at the dental office. Linda spoke politely about her husband and children, though her words felt rehearsed, as though she were summarizing a story that no longer belonged to her. When Richard shared that he had moved back to Columbus after a divorce, working in sales for a regional equipment company, Linda felt an unexpected connection. Here was someone who had once known her before the titles of wife and mother had defined her. Throughout the evening, they drifted toward each other repeatedly. They danced once to a familiar 80s ballad, laughing about their awkward teenage selves. For Linda, it felt like a spark had been reignited, a piece of her youth restored. When the reunion ended, Richard asked for her phone number. She hesitated only briefly before giving it. In the weeks that followed, their messages grew from casual exchanges to longer conversations. By early November 2019, they were meeting for coffee, then lunches, and eventually, discreet evenings at a small hotel on the outskirts of the city. Linda justified it to herself as just a temporary escape. She told herself Daniel would never understand how lonely she had felt in their marriage, how unseen she had become. With Richard, she felt desired again, valued, and most dangerously free. Meanwhile, at home on Willow Creek Drive, the Harper household remained outwardly stable. Daniel continued his routine of long workdays at the financial firm, managing bills, and maintaining the appearance of a solid suburban life. But Daniel was not blind. He noticed Linda's distracted smiles at her phone, her sudden eagerness to meet a friend for coffee, and her increasingly distant behavior in the evenings. Their children, Emily and Jacob, were occupied with their own teenage lives, and for them, their parents' occasional silences or sharp words didn't seem unusual. To the outside world, the Harpers were still the dependable family in the brick house at the end of the cul-de-sac. But inside, tension had begun to build. By December 2019, Daniel confronted Linda one evening in their kitchen. It was just after Christmas, on December 27th, when the children were asleep upstairs. He asked her directly if she was seeing someone else. Linda denied it, her voice trembling, but Daniel's eyes lingered on her face with quiet suspicion. He didn't press further that night, but the seed had been planted. In January 2020, Richard began to press Linda about the possibility of a future together. He would ask her if she was happy in her marriage, if she ever imagined leaving Daniel. Linda brushed off the questions, reminding him she had 2 children and a home to consider. Still, the idea lingered in her mind. For the first time in years, she wondered what her life might look like without Daniel, what it might look like with Richard. The pandemic that swept across the country in March 2020 complicated everything. With Daniel working from home, Linda found it harder to keep her secret. Texts had to be deleted immediately, calls had to be short. Yet somehow she managed to keep the affair alive, sneaking in meetings when restrictions eased or inventing excuses to step away. The risk only fueled the intensity of the relationship. By the summer of 2020, the cracks in Linda and Daniel's marriage had widened. On July 18th, a Saturday evening, they attended a family barbecue at Daniel's brother's house. Relatives later recalled Daniel appearing unusually tense, keeping a close eye on Linda. A cousin remembered overhearing Daniel say in a low, harsh voice, "We'll talk about this when we get home." Neighbors noticed as well. In late August 2020, one neighbor, Margaret Lawson, no relation to Richard, recalled hearing raised voices coming from the Harper house one evening. She later told investigators she had heard a man shouting, "You think I don't know?" followed by the sound of a door slamming. Despite the mounting pressure, Linda continued to see Richard. The thrill was too powerful to let go. She felt caught between 2 lives, the respectable mother and wife in the quiet suburbs, and the passionate, reckless woman rediscovering love with an old flame. By the fall of 2020, however, Daniel's suspicions had hardened into near certainty. His once calm demeanor grew colder, more controlled. He began checking Linda's phone, questioning her about her whereabouts, and making comments that hinted he knew more than he revealed. To Linda, it felt like living under surveillance. She grew anxious, fearful not just of losing her marriage but of the consequences if Daniel decided to expose her secret to their children, her parents, and the wider family. The Harper household had become a pressure cooker, silent meals, tense stares, and an air of inevitability that something was about to break. And in just a matter of weeks, everything would. By late October 2020, the Harper household had become a tense battlefield of silence, suspicion, and restrained anger. What had once been small cracks in the marriage now resembled wide fractures. Daniel Harper, normally a man of calculated composure, began watching his wife more closely than ever. He had never been an emotional husband, but when betrayal touched his pride, it triggered something darker inside him. On the evening of October 28, 2020, Daniel discovered what he had long suspected. It began with something seemingly small, Linda's phone buzzing while she was in the shower. Daniel picked it up, intending to glance at the notification. Instead, his eyes froze on the screen. A message preview read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? R." The initial surge of rage nearly overwhelmed him, but Daniel forced himself to remain calm. He waited until Linda came downstairs, her hair still damp, her robe tied loosely at the waist. He held the phone up, his voice icy and controlled. "Who's R?" Linda froze, her throat tightening. For a split second, she considered lying again, dismissing it as a wrong number or a harmless message. But the look in Daniel's eyes told her it wouldn't work this time. He already knew. Her silence was an answer in itself. Daniel placed the phone on the kitchen counter, leaned both hands on the surface, and whispered in a tone more terrifying than a shout, "You've been cheating on me." The argument escalated quickly. Daniel's voice grew louder, sharper, as he demanded details. How long, with whom, how many times? Linda, panicked, admitted more than she should have. She told him about Richard Lawson, their history, the reunion, and how things had spiraled out of control. Daniel's face turned red with fury, veins rising on his temples. He slammed his fist against the counter so hard that Linda flinched. "You think you can humiliate me like this? In front of our kids? In front of the family?" he shouted. Linda tried to calm him, insisting she still loved her children, that she never meant to hurt anyone. But Daniel was beyond reason. That night, he threatened to take everything from her. "I'll file for divorce. I'll tell Emily and Jacob exactly what kind of mother you are. I'll tell your parents, your brothers, everyone. You'll have nothing, no house, no kids, no reputation. Do you hear me?" The words hit Linda harder than she expected. Losing her children was her greatest fear. Daniel knew this and wielded it like a weapon. The argument ended only because Jacob came downstairs after hearing the shouting. Linda plastered on a smile, telling him everything was fine, while Daniel clenched his jaw, his chest still heaving with rage. For the next few days the house felt like a war zone. Daniel barely spoke to Linda except to issue sharp remarks. He worked in his home office for long hours, emerging only for meals, his presence colder than ever. Linda moved quietly around the house, terrified that any word or action would set him off again. But Daniel wasn't done. On November 2, 2020, he confronted her again late at night. He had printed out phone records he had obtained through their shared account. The pages showed dozens of calls and text exchanges with Richard over the past year. He threw the papers onto the bed where Linda sat, her heart pounding. "You lied to me. Over and over. Do you think you're going to walk away from this without consequences?" Linda tried to explain, but Daniel interrupted, his voice low and deliberate. "I'll bury you in court. You'll never see the kids again." It was then that Linda felt the walls closing in. 4 months, she had convinced herself she could keep her two lives separate, the respectable wife and mother, and the woman who rediscovered love in secret. Now Daniel threatened to tear it all apart and she had no control. She confided in Richard days later, meeting him in his car near a deserted parking lot on November 5th. Tearfully, she told him about Daniel's threats, about losing custody, about her fear of becoming the villain in her own children's eyes. Richard listened, his expression dark. "He can't do this to you," Richard said firmly. "He's trying to control you, to scare you. You don't deserve that." Linda clung to his words, but she also felt uneasy. There was a hardness in Richard's tone, a determination that hinted at something more than comfort. Still, she said nothing. On November 9, 2020, things escalated further. Daniel had dinner with his brother Michael at a steakhouse downtown. Witnesses later recalled seeing Daniel visibly upset, his voice low but tense. Michael would later tell police that Daniel had confessed everything that night. "Linda's been cheating with Richard Lawson. I've got the proof. I'm going to divorce her. I'm going to make sure she never gets the kids." Daniel wasn't just threatening anymore, he was laying out his plan. When Linda found out, when Daniel himself told her in their living room the next day, it shattered what little hope she had left. Daniel smirked as he spoke, as though daring her to defy him. "By Christmas, everyone will know what you really are." It was this declaration, this looming exposure, that pushed Linda into a state of panic. That night, she barely slept, pacing the bedroom while Daniel snored beside her. In her mind, the clock was ticking. Her double life was about to collapse, her children about to see her as a traitor, her family ready to turn against her. This was the moment when everything began to spin out of control. Within 2 weeks, Daniel Harper would be dead in his home office, killed by a gunshot fired from close range. The official narrative would blur. Was it Linda, pushed to desperation, who pulled the trigger in a panic? Or was it Richard, determined to protect her from the man who threatened to destroy her life? The inciting incident was not the gunshot itself, but the fatal threat that preceded it. A husband promising to expose, punish, and erase the woman who had betrayed him. From that moment on, tragedy was inevitable. On the morning of November 17, 2020, at approximately 7:15 a.m., the Columbus Police Department received a frantic 911 call from Linda Harper. Her voice was shaking, high-pitched, nearly incomprehensible at first. "My husband, he's on the floor, there's blood, oh my God, please, you have to come quickly." Officers arrived at the Harper residence on Willow Creek Drive within 10 minutes. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, most residents still inside their homes preparing for work or school. Yet the sight of flashing patrol cars and an ambulance quickly drew attention. Curious neighbors gathered at their windows as officers taped off the Harper property. Inside the house, the scene was grim. Daniel Harper lay slumped on the floor of his home office, a single gunshot wound to his chest. Blood had pooled beneath him, staining the beige carpet. His reading glasses were still perched on his face, cracked from the fall. On the desk nearby was a half-empty glass of whiskey and a stack of documents. The room smelled faintly of gunpowder, suggesting the shot had been fired recently. Linda, wearing a robe and slippers, appeared distraught. She clutched her phone in one hand, tissues in the other, her eyes red from crying. She told the officers she had gone downstairs to bring Daniel a cup of coffee and found him on the floor. She insisted she had no idea what had happened, only that she panicked and called 911 immediately. Detective Mark Sullivan, a seasoned investigator with 20 years on the force, was assigned to the case. His first impression of Linda was complicated. She looked genuinely shaken, but there was a stiffness to her account, as though she were trying too hard to convince them of her shock. The first critical discovery came within an hour. The weapon, a Smith & Wesson 9mm pistol registered to Daniel, was found on the floor about 3 feet from his body. At first glance, suicide seemed possible. But Sullivan noticed inconsistencies. The gun's position didn't align with where it would have landed if Daniel had shot himself. Moreover, the wound trajectory suggested the shot came from someone standing directly in front of him at close range. By noon, the medical examiner confirmed what Sullivan already suspected. Daniel Harper's death was not suicide. The entry wound indicated the gun had been fired from less than 2 feet away. This was homicide. When asked where she had been at the time of the shooting, Linda struggled to give a precise answer. She claimed she had been upstairs in the bedroom, showering and getting dressed. She said she came down afterward to check on Daniel, only to find him dead. Detectives noted the absence of damp towels or signs she had recently showered. Still, there was no physical evidence directly tying Linda to the weapon. Fingerprint smudges on the pistol were inconclusive, and initial gunshot residue tests on her hands came back negative. As officers canvassed the neighborhood, one detail caught their attention. A neighbor reported seeing a dark-colored sedan parked near the Harper residence the previous night around 10:30 p.m. The car was unfamiliar to the neighborhood. Another neighbor claimed to have noticed movement near the side of the Harper house around the same time. Detectives soon uncovered a bigger lead. While examining Daniel's desk, they found a folder labeled "Divorce Proceedings." Inside were documents outlining his plan to file for divorce against Linda, with notes about seeking full custody of Emily and Jacob. There were also handwritten notes, angry, pointed, about Linda's alleged affair. In one, Daniel had written, "She will not destroy this family. The kids will know the truth." When Sullivan confronted Linda about the affair, she broke down. She admitted to seeing Richard Lawson but insisted she had never intended to hurt Daniel. She claimed their marriage had been broken for years, that Daniel had grown controlling and cold. "Yes, I was unfaithful," she sobbed, "but I didn't kill him. I swear I didn't." The mention of Richard Lawson introduced a new angle to the case. Detectives tracked him down for questioning on November 18, 2020, at his apartment on the west side of Columbus. Richard, calm and cooperative, admitted to the affair with Linda. He described their relationship as complicated but loving, and denied any involvement in Daniel's death. Yet there were troubling details. Richard owned a dark gray Honda Accord, the same type of car neighbors had seen near the Harper house the night before the murder. He claimed he had been home all night, alone, watching television. But without an alibi, his statement did little to clear him. Further complicating matters, investigators learned that Richard had a firearms license and owned 2 handguns. While neither matched the Smith & Wesson used in Daniel's killing, the fact that he was comfortable with weapons raised eyebrows. Detective Sullivan began to map out the possibilities. Scenario 1. Linda, fearing the loss of her children and the exposure of her affair, snapped during an argument and shot Daniel in his office. Scenario 2. Richard, wanting to protect Linda and remove the obstacle to their relationship, came to the Harper house that night and pulled the trigger himself. By November 20th, the case was headline news in local papers. Suburban husband found dead in home office, wife and her lover questioned. The media painted Linda as the grieving yet suspicious wife and Richard as the mysterious old flame with questionable motives. The pressure mounted as Sullivan pushed harder. He requested surveillance footage from nearby streets, hoping to spot Richard's car. He also ordered a full forensic sweep of the Harper residence. Technicians discovered faint shoe prints on the back patio, prints that did not match Daniel's footwear. The investigation had only just begun, but already the lines between guilt and innocence blurred. Linda and Richard both had motives, both had opportunities, and both were hiding pieces of the truth. By late November 2020, the Columbus Police Department believed they had a straightforward domestic homicide on their hands. A cheating wife, a controlling husband, a looming divorce, and a gunshot in the home office. It all seemed to fit. Yet as the evidence began to pile up, the case took an unexpected turn that left investigators more uncertain than ever. On November 23, 2020, the ballistics report came back from the state crime lab. The analysis confirmed that the fatal shot had been fired from Daniel Harper's own Smith & Wesson 9mm pistol. But what caught Detective Mark Sullivan's attention was the gunshot residue pattern. The distribution indicated the weapon had been fired at extremely close range, no more than 18 inches from Daniel's chest. The killer had stood face to face with him, nearly close enough to touch. If Daniel had been arguing with his wife before his death, Linda would certainly have been in that position. Yet Linda's hands had tested clean for residue on the morning of the crime. Technicians reminded Sullivan that washing thoroughly or waiting several hours could reduce detectable traces, but it still planted a seed of doubt. Could Linda really have executed her husband so calmly and then convincingly staged her panic? That same day, another piece of evidence arrived. Surveillance footage from a gas station less than a mile from Willow Creek Drive. The timestamp was 11:42 p.m. on November 16th, the night before Daniel's body was found. The blurry video showed a vehicle resembling a dark gray Honda Accord pulling into the lot. The driver, whose face was partially obscured, appeared to match Richard Lawson's build. The car stayed only a few minutes before leaving in the direction of the Harper neighborhood. When confronted with this footage, Richard denied being there. He insisted he had stayed home all night, but his defensiveness only deepened suspicion. Sullivan noted how Richard's calm demeanor from the first interview had begun to crack. Then came the real surprise. On November 25th, the Harper's daughter Emily approached detectives privately. The 16-year-old looked nervous but determined. She explained that in the weeks leading up to her father's death, she had overheard multiple late-night arguments between her parents. One detail stood out. On November 10th, just a week before the murder, she recalled hearing her father shouting, "If Lawson ever sets foot in this house, I'll kill him myself." The statement added a new dimension. Was it possible that Daniel himself had confronted Richard on the night of his death? Could the murder have been the result of a heated altercation rather than a premeditated plan? On November 27, forensic investigators discovered something even more troubling. A partial shoe print found on the back patio matched a brand and size commonly sold at department stores, but when compared with Linda's shoes, there was no match. Richard, however, owned a pair of sneakers of the same make and size. While not definitive, it was enough for Sullivan to request a search warrant for Richard's apartment. During the search on December 1st, detectives found no direct evidence linking him to the murder weapon. But tucked in a drawer, they discovered a folded note written by Linda. The short message read, "I don't know how much longer I can take this. He's going to ruin everything. I need help." When shown the note, Linda broke down in tears. She admitted writing it but insisted she never asked Richard to kill Daniel. "I just meant I was desperate," she said. "I didn't know what to do anymore. I never wanted Daniel dead." The discovery changed everything. The prosecution could now argue conspiracy, that Linda had confided in Richard about her desperation, and Richard had taken matters into his own hands. But the defense could also argue that Linda's words had been misunderstood, twisted into justification for an act she never authorized. Adding to the complexity, the medical examiner issued a supplemental report on December 3rd. The trajectory of the bullet suggested Daniel had been seated at his desk when the shot was fired. His body showed signs of a brief struggle, bruises on his left forearm consistent with grabbing or blocking. This indicated that the confrontation had been sudden and violent, not a coldly executed murder. For Detective Sullivan, the picture grew murkier. If Richard had indeed come to the Harper home late that night, as the gas station footage suggested, then he may have confronted Daniel directly. But would Linda have let him in? Or was she asleep upstairs, unaware until the shot rang out? The media swarmed around the case. Headlines speculated wildly: "Love triangle turns deadly," "Wife or lover? Who pulled the trigger?" Public opinion split sharply. Some saw Linda as a manipulative woman who wanted her husband out of the way. Others saw her as a trapped wife whose desperate words had been twisted by a lover too eager to rescue her. On December 7, 2020, Sullivan made a controversial decision. Both Linda Harper and Richard Lawson were arrested. Linda for conspiracy and possible complicity in her husband's murder, Richard for first-degree homicide. The arrest shocked the community. Neighbors who once saw the Harpers as a model suburban family now watched as Linda was led out of her home in handcuffs, her children crying on the front porch. But even as charges were filed, Sullivan knew the story wasn't finished. Too many questions remained unanswered. Who had physically pulled the trigger? Did Linda's plea for help directly set the murder in motion? Or had Richard acted on his own rage, determined to eliminate Daniel once and for all? The twist was clear. What began as a simple domestic tragedy had become a tangled web of betrayal, desperation, and blurred intentions. And as the investigation moved toward trial, the truth seemed harder to pin down than ever. By mid-December 2020, the case of Daniel Harper's murder had escalated into one of the most publicized trials in the making in Franklin County. The arrest of both Linda Harper and Richard Lawson sent shockwaves through Columbus. The story had all the elements of a tabloid tragedy: suburban infidelity, a bitter marriage, a secret lover, and a sudden act of violence. Local news stations parked vans outside the courthouse. Neighbors who once exchanged polite greetings with Linda at the grocery store now whispered behind closed doors, speculating whether she had orchestrated her husband's death. Social media exploded with theories. Some portrayed Linda as a desperate victim of a controlling husband. Others branded her a cold, manipulative adulteress who plotted her husband's murder with her high school sweetheart. Detective Mark Sullivan, though confident that both Linda and Richard had roles to play, privately admitted that the case was less clear-cut than the public believed. In his notes he wrote, "We may never know with certainty who pulled the trigger. But both had motive. Both had opportunity. Both concealed the truth." On December 15, 2020, Linda appeared before the Franklin County Municipal Court for her arraignment. Wearing a plain gray sweater and no makeup, she looked pale and exhausted. Her attorney, Susan Bradley, argued that Linda should be released on bail, emphasizing that she had no prior criminal record, deep ties to the community, and 2 children who needed her. The prosecutor countered that Linda had motive to see her husband dead and had confided in Richard with words that could be seen as solicitation. Judge Harold Greer set bail at $250,000, a figure Linda's family struggled to raise. She remained in custody for another week until relatives posted the bond, allowing her to return home under strict conditions: house arrest and ankle monitor and no contact with Richard Lawson. Richard's arraignment 2 days later was more severe. Charged with first-degree homicide, he was held without bail. Prosecutors painted him as the jealous lover who saw Daniel Harper as an obstacle to his future with Linda. His defense attorney, Michael Reyes, insisted there was no direct evidence placing Richard inside the Harper home at the moment of the shooting. Still, the judge ruled that the potential danger warranted his continued detention. Meanwhile, the Harper children were caught in the storm. Emily, only 16, and Jacob, 13, were placed temporarily with their uncle Michael Harper. The siblings were rarely seen in public, though a neighbor recalled seeing Emily walking the family dog late at night, her head down, avoiding eye contact. Friends later said she felt torn between anger at her mother for the affair and sorrow at the idea that her father might have been killed by the man who once meant so much to her. As the legal process dragged on, both sides prepared for a long battle. Prosecutors believed they had enough circumstantial evidence to convict Richard. The gas station footage, the suspicious shoe prints, the lack of an alibi, all pointed to him. But proving Linda's complicity would be harder. Did her note to Richard, "I need help," constitute an actual request for murder, or was it merely a cry of desperation? In early January 2021, a new complication arose. Defense attorney Susan Bradley filed a motion arguing that police mishandled evidence during the initial crime scene sweep. Specifically, she claimed the gun had been moved before proper photographs were taken, raising questions about whether the position suggested homicide or suicide. Though the medical examiner had ruled out suicide, the defense used the inconsistency to plant seeds of doubt. At the same time, Richard's attorney pursued an alternative theory, that Daniel had been shot during a struggle, possibly even by accident, and that Linda herself might have been closer to the scene than she admitted. In interviews, Reyes suggested that Linda was manipulating the narrative to save herself, letting Richard take the fall. The tension between Linda and Richard deepened as both prepared for trial. During separate interrogations in late January, Linda insisted she had no knowledge of Richard's actions on the night of the murder. Richard, on the other hand, grew more bitter. According to detectives, he muttered, "She begged me for help, and now she acts like she had nothing to do with it." By February 2021, the case dominated headlines once more. A special investigative piece aired on a local news station under the title, "Betrayal in the Suburbs: Who Killed Daniel Harper?" It featured interviews with neighbors, co-workers, and even a former classmate who claimed Richard had always been a little too intense in high school. The piece painted Linda as the tragic centerpiece of a scandal, her image shown repeatedly, the smiling wife in family photos versus the weary, pale woman in her court appearances. Privately, Linda's mental state deteriorated. Confined to her home, ostracized by neighbors and unable to see Richard, she spent long hours staring out the window. Journal entries later revealed her sense of despair. In one, dated February 14, 2021, she wrote, "I feel like I'm drowning. Everyone thinks I'm a monster. I only wanted love. Now I have nothing." The trial date was set for March 15, 2021, and as it approached, tension reached its peak. Prosecutors prepared to argue that Linda had conspired with Richard to eliminate her husband, using her words as the trigger. The defense prepared to counter that Richard acted alone, driven by jealousy and misplaced loyalty. The community braced for a spectacle. The Harpers' once quiet home on Willow Creek Drive remained empty, its blinds drawn, a silent monument to the tragedy. Neighbors avoided the street as though the brick house itself carried a stain. The conflict had risen beyond a family's private nightmare. It had become a public drama, one where truth, lies, and desperation collided, and only the courtroom would decide whose version of events would stand. The trial of State of Ohio versus Richard Lawson and Linda Harper began on March 15, 2021, in the Franklin County Courthouse. The courtroom was filled with reporters, family members, and curious spectators. Every seat was taken. The once private tragedy of the Harper family had become a public spectacle, with every detail dissected in the press. Prosecutors argued that Linda and Richard had conspired to kill Daniel Harper. They presented the handwritten note, "I need help," as proof that Linda encouraged Richard to take action. They played the gas station surveillance video, insisting it showed Richard's car near the Harper home on the night of the murder. They emphasized the shoe print on the patio and the bruises on Daniel's arm, painting a picture of a late-night confrontation that ended with a gunshot. Richard's defense countered fiercely. Attorney Michael Reyes insisted there was no physical evidence placing Richard inside the Harper house. He argued the note was vague, a desperate woman's cry, not a murder order. He suggested that Linda, fearing exposure and the loss of her children, could have pulled the trigger herself and then shifted suspicion onto Richard. There is reasonable doubt, he told the jury. And reasonable doubt means you cannot convict. Linda's attorney, Susan Bradley, defended her client as a flawed but not murderous woman. She portrayed Linda as a victim of an emotionally cold and controlling marriage, someone who made poor choices but did not plan her husband's death. She wanted love, not blood, Bradley said in her closing argument. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Emily and Jacob were not called to testify, though Emily's earlier statement about her father's threats was entered into the record. Neighbors, co-workers, and forensic experts all took the stand. The jury listened, their faces unreadable as both sides battled over the most basic question: who fired the fatal shot? On April 6, 2021, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Richard Lawson was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The courtroom was silent as Richard stood, his face pale, shaking his head. He muttered under his breath, "This isn't justice." For Linda Harper, the outcome was different. The jury acquitted her of conspiracy and accessory charges, concluding that while she had confided in Richard, there was not enough proof she intended her husband's death. Linda broke down in tears as the verdict was read. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman, though hardly unscathed. Freedom, however, did not restore her life. Public opinion remained divided. Some saw her as a manipulative woman who had narrowly escaped conviction. Others pitted her as a grieving widow caught in a tragedy of her own making. Her children struggled to forgive her. Emily left for college later that year, choosing to live with relatives rather than return to the family home. Jacob grew distant, rarely speaking more than a few words to his mother. The Harper home on Willow Creek Drive was eventually sold. Linda moved into a modest apartment across town, working quietly at her dental office job. She avoided old friends and social gatherings, her reputation permanently scarred. She was free, but in many ways her sentence was lifelong. Isolation, guilt, and the memory of a marriage destroyed. As for Richard, prison became his new reality. In letters later released by his attorney, he continued to insist that he acted to protect Linda, that he never intended for the confrontation with Daniel to end in death. But his words carried little weight. The case of Daniel Harper's murder faded from headlines over time, replaced by new scandals and tragedies. Yet in Columbus, it lingered in memory. Neighbors still recalled the sirens on Willow Creek Drive that November morning, the family that once seemed so stable unraveling in the most violent way. In the end, the truth of that night remained partly obscured. Did Richard come with the intent to kill, or did the argument spiral beyond control? Did Linda truly have no knowledge of what he planned? The court had made its decision, but the unanswered questions left shadows that no verdict could erase. What was certain was this: a marriage of 20 years ended not in divorce but in blood, leaving behind fractured lives and a haunting reminder of how love, betrayal, and desperation can collide with deadly consequences.